Hey, this is Flo, and welcome back to the third part of our WidgetKit series, where we take the Stocks app from the 30-day Stocks app challenge from Code with Chris for the month of May, and we add a widget to it, and I explain to you all the details about configuration intents, timelines, the general setup of widgets, and so on. Until now, we have only altered this a little bit, but what we have actually done is we have worked on our configuration intent and we added the symbol parameter, which represents a stock symbol, and we have already displayed the value in a text view here. Today we are going to actually work on the widget itself, so the UI. But before we do that, I want to actually separate all of this code because right now there's 1, 2, 3, 4 different structs in one file. I personally just really don't like that. So what I will do is create separate files for all of these structs. So let's start at the top with the timeline provider. Let's copy this whole struct and let's delete it from in here and then just create a new file. Let's just call it timeline provider like this. Now in the target section down below, make sure it is not in the actual stocks app, but it is in the stocks widget extension. Hit create. And then in here, we definitely need WidgetKit. I think we also need intents. And then we can just paste in the provider here. Okay, next up, I want to extract the entry, the timeline entry. So let's remove that as well. Create a new file. Let's call it timeline entry. Once again, make sure that the correct target is selected. Hit create, import WidgetKit, paste it in there. I don't think we need intents in here, so that should be fine. And then the last thing that I want to extract is our actual widget view. So let's copy it, remove it as well, create a last Swift file. Let's call it widget view, or let's actually call it stocks widget view. Make sure the correct target is selected. Hit create. And here we need Swift UI. We also need WidgetKit, I think. Let's paste it, and that should be fine. Okay, so now that we have separated all the code, it will be a lot easier to navigate. Let's hit Command B to build the project. Okay, it failed. Why did it fail? Because now that we have separated it into different files, we actually need to specify that this is a simple entry here. And now this should work as well. I'm not quite sure why this is the case, because you can leave the generic entry protocol in here. I think it's a protocol in another class. Don't quote me on that. If you have it all in one file, but if you separate the files, then that doesn't work anymore. If you know the solution, maybe you can just write a comment down below. Okay, so now that we have everything separated, I want to show you how to use code from the iOS app inside of the widget extension. And we have basically already covered this when we created the new files. So if we open the panel here on the right, click on the file inspector, and then in the target membership, we need to make sure that any file that we want to use in the widget extension is actually a member of the widget extension target. So for example, in this widget, I want to use the line chart that we created. I also need the network calls, so the everything that we have in the content view model. And obviously we also need our stock data model and the API key. So what we are now going to do is, for example, go into the line chart, go into the inspector on the right and select the widget extension as another target. Then we can close this again. And now we can actually use the line chart in the widget extension. We will also do the same for the stock data, which is our data model, added to the extension. Now we also have the content view model the thing is that we have no service. So we would have to extract this into a service. Let me do this real quick. This isn't really important for the WidgetKit course itself. So I'll just show you what I did and get back to you in a second. Okay, so I've actually done a really quick refactoring. I have added a services group and extracted everything from our getStockData function into a static function of a stock service. It is literally copy paste, so nothing to find here except that I had to erase it to any publisher, so I could return an any publisher, which makes it just a bit cleaner. If you want to learn more about Combine, then you can just watch my Combine video. But now I have this stock service, so this is reusable, so I can now add it to the stocks widget extension target, close this file, and as you can see, I just called it in our content view model. So now we can close the content view model as well. Of course, I also added the API key.swift to our target, so we can use it in the stock service. Okay, so right now we are inside of the view. Let's close this right panel here, but I actually want to see the preview, so let's just fix the preview, and now it is also shown when we change files, so let's hit resume. Okay, now that we have the stock service and everything from the app in our widget extension target, you would think that you could, for example, call the service in the view, but that actually doesn't work because views in widgets can't get updated or redrawn. So what you actually need to do is you need to add whatever you want to have computed in your entry and then computed in the timeline. This might sound a bit weird, but let me show you what I mean by this. Okay, so in the timeline entry, this is basically our data struct. This is basically all of the values that we want to show in the view. So we also want some stock data. So let's add stock data here to our simple entry. Now inside of the timeline, actually let's make the stock data optional because that makes it easier to use it in the placeholder and in the snapshot. Okay, so now that we have the stock data in our timeline entry, our simple entry, we can go into the timeline provider and actually create a function to actually fetch the data. So let's create a func get or create timeline entry. Okay, this will need a date of type date. It will need a configuration of type configuration intent, and then we will also need the closure here at the end. Let's actually call it completion. So this is what's called with the entry as as the content. So let's copy the signature from here. Let's paste it in there. Okay. So now we can use our stock service .get stock data for our configuration.symbol, and since this is optional, we can optional chain it, and if it's nil, let's just use IBM as a placeholder. Then we can subscribe to this. Let's not care about the completion for now. Doesn't really matter at the moment. Let's just care about what happens when we get some stock data in. So let's create an entry. So let entry equals a simple entry with the date that we got, with the configuration that we got, and with the stock data that we just received here. Let's store all of this in a set of any cancelable, and to do that you actually need to change the provider from a struct to a class, because otherwise you can't mutate the cancelable set. So let's say var cancelables is a type of set any cancelable, and let's initialize it to be empty. To be able to use any cancelable, you of course need to import combine here at the top. Now we can store the subscription in our set here. And now this function can be used in the get snapshot. So let's just say create timeline entry for the current date with the given configuration and with the given completion handler here. In the placeholder, we actually don't care about the stock data. So let's just set that to nil. So let me explain to you why there are three different functions anyways. So the placeholder is, as the name suggests, just a placeholder until the actual widget is loaded. This is, for example, shown when the user adds a widget. Then get snapshot is just basically the current version of the widget. And then get timeline can be used to construct a timeline, for example, to update the widget every hour. So that's something that you could do. For this example, we will just have one entry in the timeline. So what we're going to do is, first of all, we forgot to call the completion handler down here. So let's call the completion handler on the simple entry that we just created. And now in here, the timeline will just consist of one simple entry. So we should create another function. This will be very similar. You could refactor this, of course. Let's just call this one create timeline. And instead of returning just a simple entry to the closure, we want to return a timeline with the generic type simple entry. And now we can't do it like this, so we need to create a timeline. So let timeline equals a timeline, and we will just have our one entry in there. And now there is a reload policy, and since we only have one entry, we actually don't need to reload this. So let's just say never. Then we can call the completion block with the timeline. And this now enables us to scrap all of this code in the get timeline function and just call our create timeline for the current date with the given configuration from the timeline call and with the given completion handler. Okay, so as I said, in most cases you want up-to-date information in your widget, so you should definitely create several entries in the timeline, put them into an array and pass that array into the timeline here, and then call the completion block with all of these different entries. Just for the sake of simplicity, I'm not going to do that, but it shouldn't be too hard to do that yourself. Let me actually explain the timeline in a bit more detail, because I think I skipped over it a bit too much until now. So what we did is we called the create timeline method in the get timeline method, which is part of the intent timeline provider protocol. Now what the timeline allows you to do is to create an array of entries, each with a date specified. So for example, you could create an entry for right now, which is the current state of the widget. And then you create a second entry in 30 minutes, which would then refresh the widget and show some new information. And then 30 minutes later, another entry, and so on. So you could split up basically the future, so the timeline of your widget. When is this useful? For example, in a calendar app, where you already know what you want to display in, say, 30 or 60 minutes. But as we are dealing with stocks here, we can't predict them. So they are going to change in the future, but we don't know to which value. So we also don't know what to feed into our widget view, so what we need in our simple entry. Because of that, it really makes no sense to already create the entries for the future inside of the timeline. So what we can do instead is when we initialize the timeline here, we just pass the single entry for right now with the current stock data that we fetched from our stock service. And we can actually provide a policy. And now if I remove this and press the dot again, you can see the three options. So the first option is at end, a policy that specifies that WidgetKit requests a new timeline after the last date in this timeline passes. So once the last entry's date in this timeline is over, then the getTimeline method will get called again and a new timeline is generated. Never, as a time reload policy, specifies that the app prompts WidgetKit when a new timeline is available. And then the third policy, after a date, a policy that specifies a future date for WidgetKit to request a new timeline. So with that, you could, for example, fill your timeline for 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. and you know there won't be any events in the calendar from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. So you can then just say, okay, you don't need to refresh the timeline at night. Let's just refresh it after 8 a.m. tomorrow. Just an idea where this could be useful. I think in our case, the at-end policy is useful because, as again, WidgetKit requests a new timeline after the last date in a timeline passes. So this could, for example, be useful. So we could put this right here. And then internally, WidgetKit also doesn't request a new timeline over and over and over again because the operating system iOS actually throttles it and handles the amount of requests you can send. So I think it's rather safe, at least at the moment, to use the at-end policy here. Because once again, after this entry here is over, then a new timeline will get requested. Okay, so now our timeline provider is done. So we can actually go back into our stocks widget view. As you remember, our timeline entry now has the stock data associated with it. So what we can do is we could change this now a bit, and for example add another text field with the entry dot configuration, not dot configuration, dot stock data. This is optional, so we need to optional chain it, and let's for example say the latest close value, which is a computed value I think that we created. And since this is optionally chained, we should add a default value here. So let's just say default. Okay. I'm not sure if it will work in the preview, so let's find out. Okay, so it won't work in the preview because the preview actually doesn't call the timeline. So we will have to run this in the simulator. Okay, and as you can see, the widget now displays the current time from the first text view here. It displays the selected symbol from the second text view here, and it displays the latest close value which we fetched via an API in this third text view here. Now, the next thing that should be done is add the line chart that we created in the stocks app and actually put it inside of our view here. So let's do that real quick. For that, what we can do is look into our content view and see how it is implemented here. Okay, so it just takes the close values of the stock data. So actually I think we can just copy all of this code here. So let's just copy it, go into our stocks widget view. I think we can remove the date now. We can also remove the latest close values and instead put in the line chart. We don't have a stock, but what we have is our entry.stockData.close values. And if those are nil, then we'll just pass in an empty array. Okay, so let's hit try again here. I think we will see nothing because the array will in fact be empty because the stock data will be nil from the preview. So let's just run this in the simulator right away and then we can see what happens. Okay, and as you can see, now we have our symbol at the top because this is a VStack with the symbol here, and then we have our line chart below. And now If we tap on the widget, it actually directly opens the app. Okay, great. That's it for this part. I know it's a very lengthy one. I hope you still learned a lot. I hope it was fun. And in the next one, we will handle different size classes and adding different widgets to one app. So see you in the next one.